You know, that when I said about screwed up books, they just didn't have the right person doing the right job. So a lot of people say, well, Eric, we get an audit. The audit's going to catch the fraud. That's why we do an audit. This quote came out of from an auditor at the special districts conference. I thought it was great. He said that only 3% of fraud is caught by an auditor, and that more importantly, it's not the job of the auditor to find fraud. The job of an auditor is to ensure, to the best of their ability, that your financial reports, your financial operations reflect the actual what's happening at the district. Now, fraud could be caught while doing that, but obviously when only 3% of fraud is caught by the auditor, they generally don't catch fraud by what they do. So really keep this in mind. If anyone ever says, or you as a board member are relying on the audit to make sure that no fraud is happening, that's not the truth. Do not rely on your auditor to catch fraud. It may not, it will probably not show up in your audit. More importantly, and I use as an example, one of the embezzlement things that came up a long time ago, the auditor, how they finally caught the embezzlement was the fact that there was actually no audit happening. The person who was the financial person was faking the audit every year. They knew what the current colored cover of the audit was. And if someone who's looked at audits for a long time or financial reviews, they're pretty much boiler template language in there. And the only thing that changes are the numbers. And so this financial person at the district was just putting some new numbers in every year, slapping the new color cover on it, and presenting it to the board of directors saying, look, everything is fine. It wasn't until a board member actually happened to be at a cafe, saw what they thought the auditor was, and said, thanks, we just looked at your audit last night. It was great. And the auditor said, I haven't done your audit for 3 years. And that's how they found out about the embezzlement. So just getting an audit, hopefully this never happens again, but is the audit even a fraud? So just something to keep in mind. Do not depend upon your auditor to catch any fraud. So internal controls. There's kind of 3 things here you want to think about. You want to make sure that you have a policies and procedures, your financial policy that follows the money. And I'm going to have a little diagram in a second about kind of what that looks like. But you basically, for every step that money is handled, you want to have some policies around how that is handled. Then you want to make sure to segregate the duties of the people in the office who handle money. And so you might have to be creative in small offices, but you need to segregate those out. I'll go a little more detail about those segregation are in a minute, but you want to make sure that no one person handles every or part of a transaction or even a couple different parts. So, that the person who writes out the checks isn't the one who signs them. The person who reconciles the bank statements is not the same one who gets the bank statements, things like that. And we're going to go into a little more detail about that later. And then verification of work. That's where your job as a board is to verify that work. That where they bring the financial reports to you at every board meeting, and then you have enough information and enough questions asked that you are actually making sure that the financial reports accurately reflect what you believe is happening at the district. And then, of course, you do have the external audit and reviews. It is a tool, but it is not, as we said before, what's going to probably catch any fraud. It's just one of the tools you should have to try to deter fraud. So your policies and procedures, as I said, should follow the money. Up here is a list of some of the things, and there could possibly be more. For instance, who has the authority to access online banking or look at online banking? That's something new. But you're looking at, what's the process of authorizing payments and authorizing those expenditures, and then who does the recording? Who is actually your bookkeeper? Looking at you can open and close accounts or credit cards and things like that. Who moves money around? reconciliation, and then most importantly, make sure that those checks are locked away and kept in a secure location. Scott, did you have a question? Or oh, you're muted. Still muted. I can't hear you.
I have a question later, but I'm just trying to read the slide.
Oh,
it's
okay.
so small. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry if it's small. Sorry about that.
That's okay. My phone is small. Keep going.
All right. Okay. All right. So segregation of duties. So this is where, as I said before, that no one person controls part or all of the different things. So this is just an example, maybe for a small district or even a larger district. But bills come in, invoices, and they're reviewed and approved by the project managers. There's some way for the project manager to sign off on that separate, and then they're handed over to the QuickBook bookkeeper, who enters them into QuickBooks and writes the checks, and then the check is signed by a board treasurer. In a small office, especially, partly because of the resources of your district, but also for segregation of duties, I really encourage districts to actually outsource their bookkeeping to a competent person who knows fund accounting. And there's plenty of small tax folks out there, small bookkeepers. It's their business, who know fund accounting, who maybe work with the Watershed Council, other local nonprofits to do fund accounting. And probably one of the greatest segregation of duties, especially in a small office, is that bookkeeping is done by that external thing, because that external, they're only doing a really small part, and it's completely separate from everything else. Bank statements. So, one of the things that, fraud could occur, I actually think about all the different ways it could happen, is often taking a check way out of sequence and then writing it to yourself. And so it, and so it's way out of sequence and no one really knows and catches that. But if the bank statement comes to someone who's not associated with the process, they can take a look at it, and then they can see if there's anything interesting or bizarre or strange on that bank statement. So I know several districts, and I think it's a great idea. The bank statements are actually mailed to a director that's not involved in any of the process. They're not a check signer. They are not the treasurer. They're not the chair. They're just a regular old board member. They get that bank statement. They open it up. They look at it for anything strange or out of the ordinary. They make a note of it, and then they pass it on to the bookkeeper for reconciliation. They actually, there was a district that actually had their bank statement sent to their local NRCS DC, their district conservationist. They were the best one that had nothing to do with the district operations. And so the DC, an NRCS employee, would take that bank statement, open it up, look through it for anything strange or unusual before passing it on to the bookkeeper. So those are some of the things you can do. And then, of course, you have to reconcile that with it. And then the last part of that is the verification part. And that's where the check register and transaction are reviewed at the board meeting. And I'm going to talk a bit more about kind of what the things you'd be looking at in the check register. Verifying the work. As I said, I think earlier, having someone who's an expert in financial reports should be doing a detailed review. I do like boards that the board treasurer is the one that comes to the board meeting and said, I've reviewed the treasurer's report. I've found it adequate. Now, if it stops there, which sometimes it has, and the rest of the board goes, okay, sounds good, that's probably not a good thing. On the other hand, it'd be a great thing if the board treasurer gives a report saying, I reviewed this in detail. I think it's adequate. Does anyone have any questions? And that there is a little bit of that discussion back and forth, and other board members actually take a look and make sure they don't just trust the treasurer either. They take a look too, but they have that idea that the treasurer or another board member or an associate board member has actually gone through as an expert, or hopefully with some knowledge of financial reports, and looked at those in really detail before the board meeting. If the board is getting the treasurer's report at the meeting, which happens a lot, and they're just given a few minutes to look through it, even if the manager is saying, oh yeah, everything's good, we took in this much money, this much money went out, that's probably not enough time to really review adequately those financial reports. So they really should go to at least one board member ahead of the board meeting, and preferably all the board members ahead of the meeting. And preferably someone should be tasked with looking at it in depth and asking questions. So the other verifications, of course, are the auditor. This probably makes every manager cringe when I say change the auditor every few years, because it is so hard to find auditors. Totally understand that. One of the reasons why is, well, in that case, embezzlement. If you change the auditor, then that actually would happen. But also because when you go and you change auditors, the new auditor has to actually look at your operations and your books in a little more detail, because they don't know who you are. In fact, some auditors charge more the first year than they do in subsequent years because of the extra work involved. But that's a really good verification of what's happening, is by having that little bit more in-depth review, just because you have a new auditor with a new set of eyes. And then again, getting some training for your board and for your staff is very important. Very important thing here, trust is not an internal control. I will tell you that the couple districts I've been working with in the last year or two who have ran into severe financial situations, the boards, both of them said, but we trusted our manager. We trusted them. Trust is not an internal control. Please understand that. You want to trust your staff, but it is not an internal control. It's really hard on here, but we trusted our person. There's the idea of trust but verify. It's really important. All right, any questions before we go to financial reports? Go for it, Scott.
Yeah, I was curious what kind of data that we should be looking at the board meeting. I know the check register is, for me, a very important one. And the other one, the key thing seems to be our expenditures versus a budgeted amount. So
yeah,
I'm just interested in knowing what is the recommended data that provided to the board members on the financial report.
All right. Well, that's actually the screen that's right up here.
Okay.
Where I have kind of what I feel, this is my personal opinion about what the minimum bank statement or financial statements are, and probably the extras. So first of all, a balance sheet, and not for the reason that you think. The balance sheet, and we're gonna go through a sample financial report in a minute. The balance sheet, most people know because they actually have at the top under assets what your checking account and your savings account and balances are, how much money you have in the bank. And often that's all it's looked at. But there's some other aspects to a balance sheet about your liabilities that you're going to want to take a look at. And actually I find to be more important than actually how much money is in the bank. And we'll talk about that. Obviously, your monthly profit and loss is good to see about what money's coming in and went out in the previous month. But realize that the way you work, districts work, and the way you work on grants and the way you work on projects, that a huge amount of your money could be project worked and coming in and coming out in very odd ways, not in the same month. Or you might have a whole bunch of money coming in to cover a project, but it's not covering your day-to-day operations. So your monthly profit and loss you should be looking at, but it's not necessarily something on its own that's going to tell you a whole lot. Because for instance, you could, and I remember doing this, getting a $900,000 check from OWEB to do some helicopter logging at the end of a month. So it looked like we made a fabulous like $800,000 profit for the month. And then the next month, all that money went back out. And it looked like we had an $800,000 loss. So if you just looked at 1 month on its own, it's not going to really tell you much. And also you need the context of what that money coming in and out is actually being used for. The same with the year-to-date profit and loss versus budget for your key grants in your general fund, which is your unrestricted, which you can use on anything and is often used for your basic district operations. That's good to look at so that you can see where you are versus your budget. But again, remember that some things, and we'll look at this in the sample financial reports, might be big one one-offs, like say your liability insurance. So if you're going, oh my gosh, we spent 110% of our funds and it's only, halfway through the year for insurance, that's probably okay, but you need the context for that, where you hopefully will have very consistent payroll, and that if you are 6 months through the year, your payroll should be about 50%, or your rent, things that are very consistent. But you'll need to know what are those should be consistent expenses versus your one-off expenses. So you have to be careful about that. Check register, very important. As Scott said, you do need to know all those checks and where the money went and who they went to. You should be looking at it and looking for any oddities. You should be asking questions like, I have never seen a check go out to this vendor before, XYZ excavation, and suddenly there's a $15,000 check to them. What was this check for? You should ask those questions about those things you don't normally see in there, those big expenses. Also, make sure that every check is accounted for. So if there's a skip should never be a skip in a number, it should say voided. And you probably at some point should double check and make sure those voided checks are actually kept with your regular checks and everything like that, so you know that they actually truly were voided out. And then of course, if there's any outlier checks, like normally your checks are 1,500 through 1,700 for the month, but then there's one at 5,000 something probably is wrong there, or could be wrong there, and you should be checking up on that. Your credit card statements. So usually what you see in a check register is going to see payment to Wells Fargo, or whatever your bank credit card is, and it will say under there various in terms of what the note is for, and then $1,500. That does not tell you anything if that money was properly spent. Part of your financial report, if you have a credit card, should be the credit card statement, so that the same way you look through the check register, you're looking through that credit card statement. You're making sure that all the purchases on a credit card are appropriate for the work of the district. Because that is, when you start looking at like some of the financial scandals at the state level, that's often where you'll find them, is in, when there's all these massive credit card statements and people aren't catching when there have been misuse of the credit card. And in this last one, the fund balances. The fund balance is arguably, to me, the most important financial statement, and the one I see the least with districts. What the fund balance is, it says that if you have, say, $100,000 in the bank, who owns that $100,000? Because of that $100,000, some of it is probably for very specific grants, and some of it is for general fund. And the way grants work and the law works, which we'll talk about in a minute, is that grant money, when you receive it from your grantor, can only be spent for those specific purposes that are in the grant and nothing else. So you could have, and I have seen this, especially with these districts that run into financial problems, where they could have several $100,000 in their checking account and yet be underwater, similar to being underwater with a house. Because of those hundreds of thousands of dollars, they have overspent their own unrestricted funds, their general funds, and been borrowing from other grants to cover their expenses. And then when it goes to do the grant, they don't have that money. So it's a case of where you could have lots of money, so the balance sheet looks great, but you are actually bankrupt. Vice versa, I've actually worked with districts who had maybe only a few $1,000s in their bank account and they were really stressed out. But when we looked at their fund balances, I'm like, you need to request money from all these different grants, and you need to transfer over your administration fees because you haven't done that for years. And then suddenly they might have $3,000 in the bank, but really they actually have over $30,000 of their unrestricted funds. This literally happened at a district before. Question? No? Okay. I'm going to go through some sample reports in just a minute, but one quick thing, I want to talk about data versus information. So data is probably what you're getting in your financial reports. It's just numbers. It's just a whole bunch of numbers on there. probably with very little context besides saying, yeah, well, that was $10,000 spent on payroll. Doesn't really tell you a whole lot. What you really need is information to make informed decisions. And I really like for you folks to start thinking about your financial reports as being mostly data, but you needing information. You need context. The fund balance sheet is really about context, where where that money belongs, but also, having discussions, having your manager, your bookkeeper, your financial officer, whoever it is, give background and context to these numbers. Numbers is data. It's really hard to make decisions based on data, but how can that data be transferred into information? You have the expert, that treasurer, that associate director, who can go and understand the financial reports and then translate it into information for you at the board meeting. What does this mean? This, besides a bunch of numbers on the paper. I have charts and graphs down there because for a lot of people, charts and graphs make things more understandable to them when they have those. At the Upper Willamette, they definitely went and said, hey, to their financial manager, we would like some charts and graphs because we can look at that and understand it so much better than these complex local budget law financial reports, which is just a bunch of numbers. So that's what that financial officer has done at the Upper Willamette. And I think that's really important. So try to get your data, your financial reports turned in more into information so that you have a better idea to make more informed decisions. All right, it's going to take me a second here to get to the financial report. So hold on a quick second here. I got to reshare a different screen. Okay, I need to make this bigger, especially for Scott, who's on his phone. Okay. Oh shoot. Are you? Let's see.
Go ahead.
Can you see this balance sheet up here, everyone?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. It was saying for some reason my sharing was paused, so I didn't know if it was actually paused. All right, so most people are familiar with the balance sheet. What most people, when you look at a balance sheet, is you always look to see how much money you have in the bank. And that's good. You should know how much money you have in the bank. But it's not going to tell you the whole story. It's just how much money you have in the bank, but it doesn't tell you how much money you might owe other people, or it may not show who owns that money, as I talked about before. This is a very small district. This is financial reports from one of my favorite bookkeepers, who I will not name. They actually do books for a couple different districts, a couple of small ones, but by keeping it a small district, it'll be easier to explain what I would be looking for. Probably for you districts that have tax bases, you're going to have much more complex balance sheets and statements. But the same idea for what to look for will actually be true. So so you have your assets. You might have some current assets and stuff like that. Accounts receivables, if you do account receivables. Most districts are on some modified cash basis, so they don't actually show your receivables and payables in your balance sheet, but some do. But one thing that should be in your balance sheet, and it's easy to do if it's not happening already, and you can ask your bookkeeper to do it, is your payroll liabilities. In all cases where there has been some fraud or mismanagement of funds that I am aware of, for the most part, has happened with your payroll liabilities. When you start running into cash flow problems because you're not, doing your reports on time and you're not getting your checks from OWEB or wherever, or if someone wants to steal money, it's a little bit harder now with the direct deposits for payroll, but in old days it was much easier when you had checks in hand. This is where generally this happens, because the first thing that I've seen districts do when they have cash flow problems is they don't pay their payroll taxes so they can keep doing their payroll. So as a board member, you should be looking at this in your liability section of your balance sheet. It's rare that the payroll liability is actually zero, because for every payroll time period, you're going to be accruing some liability. It's the money you take out from the paychecks, and it's the money the district owes for their half of Social Security and everything like that. This number will go up usually by quarter, because most people pay by the quarter. You'll see it go up for 3 months, and then it should drop back down again. Maybe not to zero, but lower than it was. And then it should go back up again. So I think it's really important for directors to make sure that this payroll liability line is there. One of the warning signs, the red flags for financial, if you're not getting a balance sheet, I hate to say it, that, we want to trust our employees, but they could possibly be trying to hide what they know is on the balance sheet that they don't want there, including any possible, if they do actually spell out your accounts payable liability, that number is also getting larger and larger and not falling. All right. Now, for a lot of the cash basis, you're not going to see receivables or payables on there. What I do see districts do, and I did it myself for my board of directors, is I manually had a little spreadsheet where I listed the large outstanding bills and how long they were outstanding for. Anything over $1,000. Often I was waiting for, money from OWEB before I would pay them or something like that. But there would be a list for the board of what those payables were of at least a certain amount. And the same with the receivables. I'd list, okay, I've actually asked for money from OWEB for these specific grants for this much money. And so I think that's a good report to have too, if you don't have the receivables and the payables in your balance sheet. Here's a check register. I realize this is not a very good check register, because in this instance, there's not a single check written that month for the district. Everything was an electronic funds transfer or a direct deposit. But this is something you should be looking at. You should be asking questions if you have any questions. If anything is there that doesn't happen on a regular basis, anything that's really large. If a check is out of sequence, if there's at all, or and if there is a credit card statement, because on this thing it'd probably just say in their name, like Wells Fargo account might say, Visa, or it might actually have something different, or might say split because it's going to many different accounts. It might say various under grant name, or it might say it's for the general fund, and it'll have the amount. Well, that doesn't tell you, what was spent in that credit card. So you want to make sure that along with your check register, if you have a credit card, if you have a debit card, that you're actually getting the statement which has everything attached to it. All right. So here is a combination at the bottom. We'll scroll down because it'll be the fund balances. But this is, when it says statement of activity, this is actually kind of this is the profit and loss for year to date. You could also do one for the month. But either way, if you notice across the top here, these are all your different funds. And for some districts, they might have 20 or 30 different funds because you got that many grants. There's only a couple different funds here. But the same thing holds true whether you have 30 or 40 funds or you just have a few funds. And in some, especially taxing districts, you may have to actually separate these out a little bit different, but the idea is still the same. So this shows, again, the profit and loss for the year. It's a good snapshot to see where the money coming in is going, whether it's for the month or for the year. But what's really more important to me are these fund balances down here at the bottom. This tells me who owns, as I say, the money. Where does that money belong? If that 68,000 that this district had in the bank, where is that money allocated out? And if you look on the left side here, there's the 8,000 that's in readily available unrestricted cash for district operations. That 4,000 is they separate out their paid time off, so it can be paid out through that. That's that fund. But the rest of the money can be only used for very specific purposes. Now, these folks are in pretty good shape. They have very positive fund balances. There's only one negative fund balance over here on the far right, the negative 9048. That's because they've closed out the grant and it says in process, which the bookkeeper put that in there saying they're in process of actually asking for that money. Um, uh, what this bookkeeper will do is under each one that has a negative balance, it'll say in process or need to process or request made. And therefore the board can go, oh, okay, I see there's a negative balance, but I know that they're actually working on it. Now, if there's a lot of negative balances there's two important things to think about. It's really important, like, are they working on fund requests? So having that in process or request made is important, so you know that. Or if it's not there, ask, like, are we making fund requests? We have a lot of negative balances here. And to let you, just to know that by law, since these funds for grants can only be spent on those grants, if you do have negative balances, by law, they have to be covered by your unrestricted funds, which you could use on anything, including covering the negative grant. So that negative 9048 is being covered by that $8,000. Now, that doesn't always happen. And we've had discussions with OWEB long ago about, how often does it happen, but they know it happens. And sometimes, especially in smaller districts, they are having to cover one grant with another grant. Technically, that is illegal. They know it happens. You should do your best to do it as little as possible. But also, this kind of fund balance things will give you an idea of like, hey, hey, bookkeeper, hey, manager, we really need to get on top of this because we have these negative balances and we don't have enough of our general fund to cover it. Please tell us what's going on. Are you making the appropriate fund requests? So as I said, this fund balance is probably one of the most important things, because if you have a negative number in your unrestricted funds, you're bankrupt, because that means that you are using other people's money, other grant money, to cover your expenses. If you ever see a negative number in that column, please call me. Please let me help you out, because that means that you quite literally are bankrupt because you're using grant money to cover your expenses. Here's just another one this person does. It's the month-to-month comparisons for all the different items there. This is good to take a look at, see if there's consistency, like the fiscal provider, the bookkeeper, very consistent. Payroll actually does jump around quite a bit, so that might be a question. But it's consistent except for 1 month. You might ask, like, what happened in that month? And so, and in taking a look, yeah, storage unit is consistent. So this is where you look at consistency. You might see one-off items such as your insurance line item there. But those are the things you want to take a look at. Make sure the consistent things are consistent and the unique things are unique.
Eric?
Yes.
A quick question. Our district 6 months ago or a little longer went to Arch payments for their salary.
Yep.
And basically it throws a big hole in the middle of the financial report. And it's, because they don't show, what the various employees received. And it's been a concern to me. The reason for doing it was supposedly it's cheaper to do it that way than the other way. So what's your observation about that?
Well, your ACH is similar to EFT. It's going and scrolling back up. It still should show as a withdrawal from in your check register. It should still show up there. The amount that was taken out of the bank.
No, it doesn't. So
okay, well, I have to say I'm surprised by that. I'd be glad to maybe take a look at what they do offer. I mean, somewhere there has to be some kind of record of it. So you need to find out where that record is kept, because there is going to be a record somewhere. Maybe it's not on the check register through QuickBooks, but maybe you need to get a special report that's taken from your bank statements. Maybe that's where your bank statements needs to come in.
Okay.
because at some point it's got to be recorded somewhere.
Okay. Well, it's been a concern of mine for some time. I'm not the treasurer, so it's kind of not my my sandbox, but still, I'd like to see numbers that add up. Okay, it's not
yeah,
holes.
so yeah, so I think that's a very good concern to have, and that's the right kind of question to ask. So I think could work with your treasurer and your bookkeeper and your manager to find out where that record is and make sure that that's included in your financial report because it's going to have to show up somewhere.
Okay, good enough.
Okay. All right. So this district wanted a comparison from this current fiscal year to the last fiscal year. I think this is a quite adequate one. There could also be one about the fiscal year, the budget. That would be a really good one. This district doesn't get that. But this is how they can look and say, like, wow, at this time last year, we spent, only 32,000 on our watershed tech person, but now we're spending 41. That's a 33% jump. Why did we have a 33% jump? A good question to ask for that. So this is another one where it's data, but try to transfer it into information and ask the right questions. All right, and then the individual grant reports. Some district boards like this, some don't. It also has the same information as what the fund balances is, but it's a little more detailed information in this way. It's split out by years. Some just have it kind of like the grant to date, how much besides being split out from years. I've seen it both ways, but this does give you an example of like, okay, here's all our grants and here's how much money we've brought in from that grant over time. This is how much money we've spent over time. And this is how much money is remaining in the grant. Sometimes this is the fund balances are actually done through this too, instead of the other way you saw it. I think what's kind of good that I see here, you see this, it expires 7/23/22, that actually there's notes in here about when things expire. And then I've seen with some districts that this kind of report in one way or the other, they look very differently in different places, but they actually say, when is the next report due? And by actually having that, the board is able to say like, hey, manager, I see that we have several reports that are overdue because they're listed there along with the grants. So that might be something to really think about that I think is really positive, is that along with some kind of grant report, some kind of fund balance report, that you actually list when the grants expire and when the next report is due so that the board can keep on tabs on when all these different reports are due. And if they look like they're falling behind, they're aware of that and can ask about that. And this may be a little bit more important in smaller districts where the board needs to be more involved in the operational level, but I still think it's important for even boards, very large districts, to keep a tab on that, because that's something where you might be able to see as a red flag that you have a lot of late reports, and you rather know about it before as it's happening and make corrective action, or at least ask about it, as opposed to getting a letter from the Department of Agriculture or OWEB saying we're suspending your payments until you get these reports in, or you cannot sign any more grant agreements until you get these reports in. That's like, you don't want to know about it then. And then there was a report here about the paid time off balances, and that's it. So those are the some financial reports. There's other ones definitely. Do you have any questions about that? Any more about financial reports? Okay, let's go back to finish up the fiduciary responsibility here. We're almost done. I really thank you for staying with it here. I really think this is important. Okay, just want to go through some of the danger signs that I see that hopefully you could talk about. Again, these minimal or no financial reports, especially month after month. If you're only getting certain financial reports and they're not really a complete set of them, which give you the context and all the other different information, ask for them. If you're being told month after month that you didn't get those financial, they weren't done in time, That's a problem too. One of the excuses I hear all the time is we didn't get our bank statements in time for the bookkeeper to reconcile the checkbook register. I will let you know that that is not a good excuse to not getting your financial statements. You can get preliminary financial statements, and pretty much, your balancing your checkbook, doing the reconciliation with the bank statement is just to double check to make sure that all the checks that you entered in were done correctly. But you could still get a financial report of a balance sheet, your P&Ls, your fund balances. Maybe they're preliminary, but you should be able to get them. And ideally, if the bookkeeper is doing the job right, when they reconcile, it will be exactly the same. And actually, if it's not exactly the same, especially month after month, you may have another problem there. Do not accept the fact that the bank statement didn't come in, that they can't give you the financial report. They can give you the financial report, at least one that says preliminary, so you can look at it and you can ask the questions. All right. Please make sure that you get those financial statements. Again, we talked about the payroll liabilities being like ever bigger and bigger. The lots of negative fund balances, that's something you want to do. If you have that negative general unrestricted fund balance, that's a huge danger sign. It means you're bankrupt. For those that still do petty cash, you want to make sure those are reconciled on a regular basis. And then not getting those itemized credit card statements. Those are some of the big danger signs for me that I see. And that's it for that. Does anyone have any other questions? I guess that took a little longer than I expected. But I'm glad you all stuck around, or at least some of you stuck around. Does anyone have any questions before we finish?
Not a one. Just wanted to say thank you, Eric.
Yeah, I am sorry that we kind of got way skewed on time. It happens.
Eric, I do have that other question that I emailed you on, but I kind of feel like I just watched you run a marathon. So if you want to do that another time, that's fine.
No, why don't we call on the phone? Why don't you, is your phone number attached to your email at all, or?
Yes. Yeah.
Let me give it is?
Yes.
Okay. Let me give you my phone number. You can all have it. And so Dean, if you don't hear from me real briefly here, call me at 503-510-8930. Did you get that?
510-8930.
Yep. Great.
Good.
All right. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Glad you found this helpful. I will be posting the recording of this as long as it is. Because I think the questions that are asked, Scott, I know you ask a lot of questions, but they're actually really good. It helps me explain things, I think, better. And other people's questions that they're actually good for people to hear these real world questions. In fact, when I do it in person and I do go to board meetings, that's, I tend to actually answer more questions and go through the slides. So that's actually what I like. Anything else? Otherwise, we will stop. And Dean, I'll call you in just a few minutes.
Okay. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So,
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
bye-bye. Take care, guys. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.